Hey everybody, welcome to Lebo Man Reviews. I'm Lee, thanks for watching. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to my channel. Today I want to talk about Ragamuffin. It's a 2014 biopic about Christian singer-songwriter Rich Mullins. It was written and directed by David Leo Schultz, who also plays Sam, who's one of Rich Mullins' best friends in the film. Stars Michael Koch as Rich Mullins, Mel Fair as his father John, and Charles Lawler as Brendan Manning. And both of those guys play a significant role in this film. I do want to give a spoiler right here at the front. If you don't know anything about Rich Mullins and you want to watch this movie, let me just go ahead and throw this out. This is going to be a huge spoiler. If you know who Rich Mullins is, it's not that big of a deal, but Rich Mullins was killed in an automobile accident in 1997, and a lot of this film is building up to that point. But because it was made for a Christian audience, the majority of the people that watched it understood what happened to Rich, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And this film was produced with the cooperation of Rich's family. In fact, his brother David actually plays a small role in the film as a radio interviewer. If you don't know who Rich Mullins is, or you're only vaguely familiar with him, he was a singer-songwriter in the Christian music industry. He's probably best known for the song Awesome God. And he first rose to fame in 1982 when Amy Grant recorded a song that he had written called Sing Your Praise to the Lord. And it's chronicled in this movie. In fact, it's a key plot throughout the movie. Rich Mullins had a very complicated relationship with the Christian music industry. He kind of was dragged into it unwillingly. He was more interested in ministry early on. He didn't really want other people singing his songs. But he eventually... Amy Grant recorded this song, and he ended up becoming a successful solo artist in his own right, but a lot of people recorded his songs. Even as recent as a band like Caedmon's Call collaborated with him, Third Day collaborated with him, and he had a really interesting relationship in the Christian music industry. During the course of his album, he released 9 albums. His final album, The Jesus Record, was actually recorded by his longtime band and featured vocals from other artists. It was released after he was killed, but it also included a disc with all of the demos that he had recorded right up to the time of his death. And like many films like this, whether they're secular or Christian, when you're dealing with biopics, they often compress actual events so you can have a manageable timeline. So there are inconsistencies in the timelines. It doesn't match up 100% true to life. And oftentimes characters' names are changed. Some characters are omitted from the story. And then you have composite characters that are kind of made up and based on different individuals. And Ragamuffin's no different. But in spite of that, in spite of the inconsistencies, especially if you already know a lot about his life, some things will be glaring, but it still manages to take an unflinching look, or as much as a PG-13 movie can allow, at his struggles, especially with his father, with the relationships he had with his friends, and even his faith. Rich's friend Sam Howard Smith did go on record saying that the film is very accurate and very inspiring. He says, I think a lot of Christian films are not of high quality and tend to be pretty thin, but this movie is deep. It shows the complexity of who he was. It shows his human struggles. And Smith goes on to say that Rich's biggest struggle was that he never felt love from his father. And that's a key part of this film. Even after he became a successful songwriter and successful artist, he still had that struggle with his dad. Smith goes on to say he was artistic. He was like one of these sensitive kids, and that plays out in the film a lot. And the struggle to gain acceptance from his father, the struggle to gain acceptance from his peers, especially there was a particular young lady that he had a romantic interest in, and she broke it off with him. And the struggle to overcome the feelings of inadequacy, what he felt was rejection. It led him into some self-destructive behaviors. He drank quite a bit, and the movie doesn't gloss over this stuff. And Smith goes on to say, some Christians may be a little offended at parts of it, but it was honest. Kind of to tag on that, this is a PG-13 film, so it's not hardcore. It probably waters down some of the things that happened. but it doesn't gloss over his faults. I mean, he chain smokes throughout the movie. He drinks excessively at times, oftentimes before and after he goes on stage to perform in churches. And he can be quite harsh to those who were closest to him. But part of that was his inadequacy to develop relationships. And that all stemmed from the relationship with his father and the fact that he felt rejected by people. But that's one of the things that I think makes Rich Mullins so interesting. That's one of the reasons I think this movie is an important movie. Uh, he was a real person who had real problems, but he also had a real faith. And he lived his entire life struggling with these things. And as a preacher, as someone who's been in church my whole life, I'll be the first to say I haven't gotten it all figured out. Even now, I'm 51 years old. I'm older than Rich Mullins was when he died. And even though I've been in church my whole life, there are things that we struggle with. There are things that we have issues with. And I believe this movie takes a real look at that and shows how people of faith, even those who are considered leaders and even those who are considered influencers, have issues. Nobody is perfect. We all struggle with stuff. But one of the other fascinating things about Rich Mullins, and this movie does a really good job, was at the height of his career in the late 80s as he was really catching on, he packed up and left Nashville, Tennessee, which would have been career suicide. Everybody told him that was dumb. And he went back and moved to Kansas, and he ended up going back to school. He got a degree in music education. And then in the last few years of his life, he and Mitch McVicker, who was a good friend of his, it was part of his little group called the Ragamuffins, they actually moved to a Navajo reservation in New Mexico and spent the rest of his days teaching music to the children there while doing concerts and continuing to write songs. One of the things it doesn't necessarily address in the movie, but an interesting fact about Rich Mullins is he made a lot of money. But at the end of his life, when he was living on the reservation, he drew a salary. He determined what the average salary for a blue-collar worker where he lived at was, and that's what he was paid. And then he had a board of directors that took all of the money he made from royalties and songwriting, and they divided it up and they tithed it. They sent it to missions. And he never knew, he never saw how much money he actually made. And he was content to live that way, teaching music to these children. He had a fascination with Native Americans. He had a fascination with Ireland. And all these things come through in his music. This isn't a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it's much better than a lot of the films produced for a Christian audience. I'll give Michael Koch credit. He doesn't really look like Rich Mullins. He doesn't necessarily sound like Rich Mullins, but he is authentic. You can go and watch YouTube videos of a lot of the concerts and a lot of the engagements that they recreate in this film, where basically they are just repeating word for word and they're recreating things that you can actually go and watch Rich Mullins do. And Michael Koch is not quite as grizzled. He's not quite as rough around the edges as Rich was in real life, but he still manages to be authentic. It feels like you're watching Rich Mullins, even though, like I said, he doesn't really look like him. He doesn't really sound like him, but he does a really, really good job. And the supporting cast of characters do a really, really good job. There are books you can go read. There's a biography called An Arrow Pointed to Heaven, which is a really, really good read if you want to read more about Rich Mullins. Rich Mullins even released some books where he was talking about his music and talking about his faith, and those are all readily available. But if you're a fan of Rich Mullins and you don't know a lot about him, this is an interesting movie. Just keep in mind it's rated PG-13, and given some of the subject matter and some of the content, especially, there's some very, very mild language coming from Rich's dad, who was a farmer. Like I said, Rich smokes throughout the whole movie. He's constantly drinking, and he can tend to be a little rough on his friends, especially when he's been drinking. So that may turn off some believers. That may frustrate some people, but I do believe it's an authentic look at real people, real Christians. So many people think that Christians have this attitude that we've got it all figured out. And this shows a believer with a very strong and very sincere faith being real and being honest and struggling. And I think the greatest message this movie shows is that Rich Mullins understood grace. He knew he would never be good enough. He knew he could never get it right. And in the end, he had to rely on God's grace to get him through, because he knew he could not do it by himself. And that's a message that all of us, myself included, need to hear that we can't be good enough. We can't earn our way into heaven, and we're going to slip and we're going to fall and we're going to be messy. But God's grace is big enough, and that's the overarching theme of this movie is God's grace is big enough. Um, as a longtime fan of Rich Mullins, and like I said, someone who has struggled with my own inner demons and my own things, Ragamuffin really speaks to me. I've watched it multiple times. I'm not sure if it's streaming anywhere. I actually own a copy of it, but if you like this type of movie, these biopics, it's a pretty good one. Once again, I don't really have the greatest rating system, but if I was going to grade it A, B, C, D, F, I would probably give it an A. It's not an A plus because there are some historical inaccuracies. There's some things they fudge a little bit, uh, and it's not a multi-million dollar Hollywood production. You can tell that it didn't have the budget that a movie like Rocket Man or Bohemian Rhapsody had. It'd be interesting to see what they could have done with that kind of budget, what they could have done. But it is much better than a lot of the films produced for Christian audiences. I think it's well worth your time. Whether you're a fan of Rich Mullins or not, uh, it's interesting to see a real Christian with real struggles and real problems dealing with God in real life. So I highly recommend this one. If you have seen Ragamuffin, leave a comment down below and tell me what you think. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. I'm Lee, and I'm done.